Hi, this is Casey Copeland, and this is Module 13, Case Study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad, for EDL 851. My case study summary, the points that I felt that were the most important from this case study. Mrs. Wilson is in her 4th year of being a principal. Mrs. Horton, a 1st grade teacher, started to have problems in Mrs. Wilson's 3rd year, but it was at the end of the year, and there were no instances to end the year. The beginning of Mrs. Wilson's 4th year, however, she started to get several complaints from teachers, letters, phone calls about Mrs. Horton's behavior toward the students in class. When a parent came to the school to demand that his daughter be switched out of Mrs. Horton's class, she set up a parent-teacher conference where Mrs. Horton yelled at the parent and accused him of being a liar. Mrs. Wilson then stopped the meeting and was going to schedule it another time so she could talk to Mrs. Horton on her own about her behavior and why she felt like she was being accused and why she reacted the way she did. Category 1, problem identification and analysis. So what do you know? Presque Elementary School is in a rural area. It is one of 3 elementary schools in the district. Mrs. Wilson is in her 4th year of being a principal. After 13 years of teaching in the district, doesn't necessarily say that she was at the school, but after teaching in the district. And then 4 years of night school to get her administrative certificate. Mrs. Horton is a former teacher of the year and 1st grade teacher. She's a seasoned professional, so she's been teaching for a while. At the start of Mrs. Wilson's 4th year of being a principal, Mrs. Horton's attitude began to change. Became a lot worse. She was less friendly than before, and she argued with other teachers and colleagues and didn't want any help from anyone. But continued. Within the first 6 weeks of the school year, Mrs. Wilson started to get, of Mrs. Wilson's 4th year, she started to get phone calls and letters about Mrs. Horton's behavior. Parents reported that she was verbally abusive to children. They also stated that she refused to hold parent-teacher conferences with them when they tried to discuss what was going on in their class and how their children were telling them what was going on. Mrs. Wilson had visited the classroom and had not found any abusive behavior. She said she had visited it regularly. The superintendent then called to talk to Mrs. Wilson about how 4 parents had called Board of Education members to talk about Mrs. Horton's behavior. One father, Mr. Stafford, demanded his daughter be moved to another class. Mrs. Stafford's wife had attempted to contact Mrs. Horton, and it had gone ignored. What do you know continued? Mrs. Wilson set up a parent-teacher meeting with Mr. Stafford, Mrs. Horton, and herself. But Mrs. Horton was not ready for the meeting. She had to rummage in her desk to find her grade book and examples of Julie's work, which made Mr. Stafford very angry anyways. When Mr. Stafford started to explain what his daughter had told him about Mrs. Horton's behavior, Mrs. Horton called him a liar and slammed her hand on the desk. Mrs. Wilson stopped the meeting to discuss her behavior in private. When Mrs. Wilson turned to Mrs. Horton for explanation, she was still angry and defensive. So what do you need to know? These are the things that I felt like I needed to know. So how has Mrs. Wilson ever worked with Mrs. Horton before? How long has Mrs. Horton been at the school? It says she's a seasoned professional, so I'm curious as to how long she's been there. Has there ever been an incident with Mrs. Horton before this? Has anyone reached out to Mrs. Horton for support during the difficult time she was going through? In the case study, it says that Mrs. Wilson found out from Mrs. Horton's colleagues that she was going through a difficult time. Mrs. Horton's husband had moved out, and she was raising her 2 teenage sons on her own. Is there a district counselor that teachers can talk to, especially when things like this happen? Is there a district counselor they can go to talk, especially if they don't have a regular counselor? How often did Mrs. Horton visit the classroom? Mrs. Wilson visit the classroom, check on Mrs. Horton in the first 6 weeks of school. It says here she regularly visited the classroom, but it doesn't say how often or for how long. And then how long were Mrs. Wilson's visits to the classroom? And did Mrs. Wilson conference with any students about what was going on in the classroom? To get their kind of the side of the story and what was happening, because it's important to hear from students what was happening in the classroom as well. So identify the problem. From the many reports and the outbursts at the meeting with the parents, there's obviously a problem with Mrs. Horton's behavior. What needs to be determined is how to help Mrs. Horton get through this time and how to make sure students are not being harmed by a hostile learning environment. Students are the most important thing in the school. That's why teachers are there. And so it's important to determine what's the truth, what issues there are, and how to help Mrs. Horton. She's obviously a seasoned professional, and she needs help with this time, but at the same time, students need to come first. So category 2, propose plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. First, I would discuss why Mrs. Horton reacted to Mr. Stafford the way she did in the meeting. I feel like that's very indicative of her behavior. If when she's confronted with something that she screams and slams her hand down instead of calmly telling them what's going on. I would get an explanation as to why she was yelling at him. I would also get her side of the story. So does she feel like there's just a couple students that are ganging up on her? Does she feel like everyone's just attacking her? Is there an issue going on? And then why she thought Julie was telling her parents Mrs. Horton was yelling at the students and belittling them from what is read in the case study, criticizing them, overly criticizing them. Second, I would then tell Mrs. Horton that her behavior is not acceptable and that it would result in a write-up, even though that would make her very angry, but that would be something to deal with at a later time. But this kind of behavior is not okay, and so unfortunately it would have to be documented. And especially with the other things going on, I feel like several write-ups would come with this as well. And then I would ask Mrs. Horton what is going on at home and to explain what issues she felt were getting in the way of her teaching, if any. Obviously there's something going on, but I want to hear from her why she felt like things were going on and why she felt like she was being accused of this. Third, I would discuss ways I could help Mrs. Horton through an obviously difficult time by having her go to a counselor or talk to a counselor at the school. At this time, you can't mandate someone to go to the counselor, but something's going to have to happen, especially if her home life is as difficult as they told that her colleagues had said it was, and it might have even be worse at this time. Proposed plan continued. Then I would end the meeting with just me and her and schedule a conference time in the morning before school the next day. Before leaving, I would ask Mrs. Horton to write down her schedule for a normal day, taking me through interactions she has with students. I would also ask her to talk to me like she would her students, so I could see how I could improve student interactions. I think it's important for her to understand and to see how she's interacting with students, if it's more criticism, it's more forceful criticism, or it's compliments, both. It's important for her to see that. And then the next morning, I would bring in a counselor, talk to Mrs. Horton, and I'd make an improvement plan for her, so it would be the three of us. And of course, the counselor could talk to Mrs. Horton on her own, but I would explain the issues that I have witnessed, issues that I have coming from other students, and decide if a counselor is needed at this time. And she obviously is. They are obviously, he or she. And this improvement plan would include Mrs. Horton's acknowledgement that her behavior at the meeting with Mr. Stafford was unacceptable. That was also in a write-up. If she doesn't sign it, she doesn't sign it. She always has that option, but at the same time, it needs to go in her file. It would include strategies to help Mrs. Horton, including a counseling plan, a meeting with the superintendent, and parent-teacher meetings. Mrs. Horton will have to meet with each family that had complained about her behavior to apologize and implement a plan to help each student succeed. Each student, if their parents complained or not, would have a plan in place. So once the ones that complained, I would have them meet with them first, and then I would have her meet with every family. The student could be there, or if the student didn't want to be there, that's fine as well. But I feel like Mrs. Horton needs to hear what the students are telling their parents and what they are witnessing, and Mrs. Horton then needs to explain her behavior. These meetings would have to be facilitated by myself or another administrator. Proposed plan continued. The plan would also include a behavior contract where it would be stated that Mrs. Horton would act appropriately towards students, parents, and colleagues, because in here it said she also did not interact appropriately with colleagues. If there was another situation like what happened in the parent meeting, it would result in another write-up. Fifth, I would inform Mrs. Horton that there would be more observations in the classroom done by me, the superintendent, or another administrator from another elementary school in the district. This would be done to ensure that the learning environment was conducive for learning. I would stress that the visits were not to catch Mrs. Horton doing anything wrong. It is to help make sure that the truth is being known. After each observation, we would meet to discuss what was observed, what strategies could be implemented to enhance learning, and what issues need to be resolved. So if it's walkthrough, if it's a whole evaluation, as an informative or a summative, but no matter how long, if it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 50, we would meet to discuss what she felt she was doing well, what issues she had, and then I would discuss, give feedback. Sixth, I would have Mrs. Horton count each time she corrected a student, use a certain voice with them, and then complimented them. She would tally that for at least 2 days to ensure that she was complimenting students more than correcting them. She would also document when a student acted out or yelled at her. And this would also include if she yelled at them, she would have to document that as well. Lastly, I would have Mrs. Horton discuss what outcomes she hoped for with this plan and what other issues she wanted to be addressed. If needed, I would assign Mrs. Horton a mentor so she could collaborate on issues that she has in the classroom and strategies to better manage this class. If it is found that Mrs. Horton is being verbally abusive, counselors will need to be brought in to help students cope with the emotional and mental effects caused by this. And then with the plan, Mrs. Horton would understand that the observation evaluations would be used to determine if she would be renewed the next year or not. Or even non-renewed at the semester. This plan would also include what issues Mrs. Horton felt needed to be resolved in the classroom, and then what help she needed to teach students to the best of her ability. Category 3, resolve the issues based on promoting the success of all students. Based on the number of complaints received about Mrs. Horton, her students are not in a safe learning environment. With something like this, the amount of complaints and the amount of times verbally abusive and demands that students be switched out of Mrs. Horton's class, there's definitely not a good learning environment going on for these students, and it's not appropriate. One student in particular, Julie, is showing signs of depression and anxiety because of the classroom environment. Her not eating, her not sleeping well, her crying every morning is definitely a sign of depression, which could manifest itself in other things. Even if Mrs. Horton is dealing with an especially rowdy and defiant class, she should not be yelling at them and making the students feel verbally abused. Mrs. Horton is a seasoned professional and should know how to handle unruly kids. Students should not be berated and put down, as this can lead to serious issues later for the students. Even yelling at just one student constantly can lead other students to become afraid to answer questions or even talk. Mrs. Horton is said to scream at children who make mistakes, which would make students afraid to even try for fear of making a mistake and being yelled at. This is what has come from other students, of course, so that needs to be taken into account. But so many students saying we can't handle this is not good for the atmosphere at all. Even if she just is yelling at a couple of students, the other students will be afraid. Category 3 continued. It is important for students to learn from mistakes in an environment that does not allow this will only harm the students. In the long run, they may come to hate school. This could lead to repeated absences and truancy, which could last the rest of their career, especially starting in first grade. That is not something that students need to deal with. Also, Mrs. Horton refusing to hold parent-teacher conferences is very harmful to parent-teacher relations and the success of students. Students cannot succeed without parent support, so it's important for teachers to include parents in learning. If certain students are the cause of issues, then parents need to be aware of the issues. If these several students are ganging up on Mrs. Horton and making her life horrible, and so she's acting out, not knowing what to do, then those students need to be dealt with, and the parents need to be contacted. Can't be ignored. Mrs. Horton refusal to even talk to parents about student concerns creates an atmosphere of isolation for the student. There needs to be an open line of communication between parents and teachers so that students can succeed. Having that, basically refusing to talk about what is happening in the class makes students feel like they're not being believed even if they are, or that what they're telling their parents is going, like, nothing's happening with that. So it's important that there is that open line of communication between them. Category 3 continued. Lastly, Mrs. Horton arriving late to school can harm the students by not giving them a chance to work with a teacher on questions they may have. Many students may not understand a specific concept on homework they needed to do, and they should have support available so they can If Mrs. Horton is not at the school when class is supposed to start, then there are more issues that arise. So if she's not there at contract time says you have to be there 20 minutes before school starts. 30 minutes before school starts, and then 20 minutes after school starts. So if she's not even getting there when school starts, that's a big issue. 1, students are left in the hall usually where bullying and harassment can occur because of no supervision, and by the time that the principal finds out that no one's there are already issues that have arisen. 2, students are missing out on valuable class time, which can really add up, especially once you get in the higher grades. It's much bigger issue. 5 minutes and a 15-minute class period is quite a bit of time, but there's only so much you can do, and so it's really important that they're using all the time they can. 3, students may feel like they are not in a structured environment. 4, students may feel like they are unimportant because of Mrs. Horton not being there when she's supposed to be. Students should feel important, otherwise they may see school as a waste of their time. There needs to be a bond between teacher and student so they feel safe to make mistakes and grow. Another reason why this is an issue is if students don't have a good home life, they need to be able to be in the classroom that they feel safe in. And if that classroom is not open until the very last minute, they can feel even more like they don't feel like they have a safe place to go. And school should be a safe place for students, and it not always is. But I feel like it definitely should have that option, and students should feel safe in the classroom. They should be able to work in peace before everyone comes to. Category 4, debrief the problem, reflection. When analyzing this case study, I was thinking about how I could get Mrs. Horton out of the classroom as quickly as possible. Like, I felt like since she was verbally abusing children, she needed to get out of there, and she needed not come back. The amount of complaints and demands that students be moved out of Mrs. Horton's classroom, coupled with her reaction to Mrs. Stafford, made me think that the best solution would be to suspend Mrs. Horton while the situation was investigated further. Even though she was not hitting students, so many of them saying she was verbally abusive to them made me think that all she was doing was harming them and needed to be taken out of the classroom immediately so as not to harm them further. As a parent, I would want her out of the classroom as quickly as possible. Especially if there was no room in another classroom, I would want her gone. But the more I thought about it, I realized it wouldn't be so easy, especially with what we learned in this class. And I talked to my principal about this case study as well. Asking what she would do in this situation and if it would have been okay to get a long-term sub or a sub in there if I put her on suspension. And she stated that teachers have to break a law to be fired on the spot or even suspended. They have to hit students or be drinking on the job, etc. So I felt like this was definitely something that made me think farther, so maybe suspension would not be the easiest solution. And this comment made me think about tenure laws and how much the school has to do when they are letting a teacher go to make sure the teacher can't sue them or come back. Teachers should not fear for their job, especially when they're doing things right. However, it should be easier to not renew teachers if they are creating an environment where students can learn, or even harming them. Obviously, these students, Julie especially, is going to be harmed by this, and it's going to take a long time. It's not a magic solution where all of a sudden, oh, we get something else, someone else in there and it'll be better. It was not going to be better for a long time, and students shouldn't have to go through that. Then when I was reading about the meeting, I felt like it could have been handled better. Having the meeting in a comfortable setting would have helped ease the tension somewhat instead of making it more uncomfortable and frustrating. They were in a kid-sized classroom, at a kid-sized table, and kid-sized chairs. As an adult, well, not me, as an adult man, it stated in there Mr. Stafford was already angry. It was uncomfortable. Both of them were uncomfortable. So I definitely felt like a counseling room would have been a lot better. And then Mrs. Horton should have done all that she could to make sure she was ready to go for the meeting so it would go smoothly. She should have had her grade work ready to go with Julie's work. She knew that this meeting was coming the next day. She knew about the day before. And it made her seem very unorganized. And Mr. Stafford was already angry, so making him wait for while she rummaged did not help her case. And then another thing I was thinking was Mrs. Wilson should have moderated the meeting more, making it seem like no one was attacking Mrs. Horton. There have been a lot of complaints and things that Mrs. Wilson had come to Mrs. Horton about, and all of it felt very attacking. And so as a teacher who goes through a lot of stress and things going on, I felt like it should have been less about attacking and more about what's going on. And the meeting should have been more focused on what Julie had told Mr. Stafford and getting to the bottom of the problem, not just outright accusing Mrs. Horton of yelling, upsetting students. I would have been reluctant to go to a meeting where I was accused of being a bad teacher by parents who hadn't been in my classroom. And then Mrs. Wilson basically just let Mr. Stafford attack Mrs. Horton that with information he had gotten secondhand. He straight up said, he didn't say, Julie told me this, or Julie said this is going on. He said, she is abusing the children. She yells with them. She criticizes them. That is not saying that his concerns weren't valid. Just more information should have been gathered about what was happening in the classroom. And it shouldn't just have been about the parent berating Mrs. Horton. So I definitely feel like Mrs. Wilson should have had a better handle on the meeting. And then category 4, issues that are unresolved or open to further investigation. So one of the issues that I have is Mrs. Horton will still be in the classroom. If the district laws are the same as the ones here, she's gonna be there for a while still. Can't just get a teacher out of the classroom, as stated before. There are just allegations of verbal abuse, which parents have reported, not students, even though verbal and emotional abuse are something that has to be taken very seriously. There's just allegations. There's not anything hasn't been seen. And then I want to know if another staff member could come in and monitor Mrs. Horton's behavior. An administrator, preferably, but I also thought about a para, especially if a class is super unruly, she could get help with students. But someone should be in there the entire time, and she might be angry about a para coming in to monitor her, while someone above her, she can't really do anything about it. With the amount of complaints, I felt like she shouldn't be alone in the classroom by herself. And I don't feel a principal could be there in the amount of time warranted for a situation like this. Even with the regular visits, I don't feel like she could see all of the things that are going on. I would like to know the district policy on this, if there is one. We need to know if the allegations are true. And again, parents are complaining, so definitely it needs to be investigated. That means that she's going to have to still be in the classroom for a little bit at least. Continued. Another issue that I have is the use of the phrase verbally abusive. Parents reported that she was verbally abusive to their children. And I looked up the definition of verbal abuse, even though there's a lot of different ones. Is when a person forcefully criticizes, insults, or denounces someone else. If she was verbally abusive, then there might be grounds for suspension, at least in the beginning, but it depends on the severity of the behavior and what the district policy is. Mrs. Horton's class might need to be recorded and then evaluated by principal and superintendent. If it is verbal abuse, police might need to be involved as well. And I want to know how to determine what is verbal abuse and what is just below that level. This could change the entire plan and situation. Again, if a couple students are ganging up on Mrs. Horton, that's a big issue. But if she is acting out, that's not acceptable. Continued. The last issue I worry about is the possible long-term effects students could have from Mrs. Horton's behavior. If their classroom environment is as bad as it has been represented, Julie in particular seems to have developed anxiety and depression. So how do we help the students that have had to suffer through Mrs. Horton's abusive behavior? It is important that there is a plan in place for students to get help and that their suffering is not ignored. Trauma, such as what has been represented, can have long-term effects on children and can cause truancy, as well as lower test scores and grades. Students might need to have counseling to not have lasting negative effects. Even then, counseling is a must. The district will have to look into how to help the students that have been subjected to this kind of treatment, and funds may need to be set aside to bring counselors so students can get the help they need. I am very concerned that so many students and parents called about the behavior and how big the class is. It doesn't state how big Mrs. Horton's class is. So if 30 students are being subjected to this on a day-to-day basis, there might be severe long-term effects and they cannot be ignored. And I think that's the biggest thing. You got to make sure that every student is being helped in the best way that they can so that they don't become to hate school and it basically ruins their life. So category 5, component 1. How do I, as a building administrator, promote the success of every student? So as an educational leader, I promoted the academic success of every student by taking the accusations made by parents seriously. In my plan, I also visit the classroom regularly to check on how Mrs. Horton was teaching and how she interacted with students. If students are afraid to answer a question, they won't learn from their mistakes. Students will only learn if they're in an environment where they feel safe to make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes. Students will not learn in an environment where they do not feel safe or they feel threatened. This is backed up by Haslow's hierarchy of needs. It is important to the academic success of every student that each teacher facilitates a learning environment, one where a student feels safe, can talk freely without fear of judgment, and can safely make mistakes. Students will not succeed unless they have a teacher that helps them and doesn't make them afraid to learn. They also need a teacher that will help them when they make mistakes and not berate them. That is why it's important to be in the classroom, observing how Mrs. Horton teaches and what kind of atmosphere she facilitates. And if she is not, she needs to be taken out of the classroom, so students are not permanently harmed by how Mrs. Horton interacts and corrects the students. The other issue that I have is I want to know what she's teaching them, because many teachers will sometimes just scream at students for not getting something and just let them be there. And so it's important that we know what she's teaching, if it's on the same state standards, and the curriculum as the other students, the other teachers, first grade teachers, so that those students are not also falling behind. Component 1 continued. As a building leader, I also promote student success by ensuring that teachers are here before and after school to help students that need it. Mrs. Horton being late to school needs to be addressed because students may have questions about homework previously assigned or need to have a safe and quiet environment to complete assignments. Some students do not have parents that are able to help them with homework. The teacher needs to be available so that students can get that extra help. Otherwise, students might fall behind in their studies and they might not be able to catch up. And another issue is that maybe sometimes their house isn't quiet enough to work on homework or read as assigned by teachers. So they need to be able to be there to get that caught up and have a quiet place to work. Making sure teachers are here before and after school each day will help students. It's also contractually, it's also in contracts. And I can monitor this by having teachers sign in every day when they get to school. Component 2. As a building leader, I will promote the personal well-being of every student. Students should not have to stay in a classroom where they feel unsafe and are constantly criticized. Even though Mrs. Wilson had done regular visits to the classroom and had not witnessed an abusive behavior, she could not be in the classroom all day. Walkthroughs are 5 minutes, mini evaluations are 30. Since this is a classroom, a grade school classroom, their students are with the teacher 5 to 6 hours every day. It's a long time. With my plan, I would make sure each another staff member is in the classroom so that students would not be harmed even more than what they have been. Students should not have to stay in a classroom by themselves with a teacher who is verbally abusive to them. This could lead to mental health issues, which students should not be subjected to. And I'm thinking that this would have to last at least a month or more, not just like here's a day and that's fine, at least a month or the rest of the semester. My plan also includes bringing in counselors to help students cope with the after effects of being verbally abused, if that is the case. It is important to not ignore the potential consequences of being yelled at and overly criticized. What is supposed to be a safe environment for students. In order to be a safe learning environment for students should be able to make mistakes and learn. And continued. Last, I promoted the personal well-being of each student in my plan when I proposed that Mrs. Horton meets with each family that had complained about her teaching and come up with a plan for each student to succeed. Having parent-teacher meetings with each family helps students not feel isolated in the classroom, and it makes Mrs. Horton acknowledge the fact that she was not doing what she needed to promote student success. I help teach students when their fears and problems are acknowledged. Having a plan for each student helps as well because each student would have a document stating how Mrs. Horton should act in class, so they aren't as scared by the unknown. These students are still young enough that they may think most teachers are like Mrs. Horton, when the opposite is true. Each student needs to know that this is not appropriate, and so that they do not fear or hate going to school. Even though this was a snippet of time, 6 weeks, its lasting effects are not yet known. And so it's important that students know that this is not what a school is supposed to be like. Now, with that being said, they can have their contract and they can be like, this is what it says. But they also shouldn't like rub it in their face or anything like that. Like, this is what this says. These students are pretty young, so that would be something that would need to be discussed with the parents as well. But they need to know that this is not appropriate, just like they have to have behavior contracts. Mrs. Horton obviously needs one too. Component 3, as the building leader, I will enhance instructional capacity. I enhanced instructional capacity by creating an improvement plan with Mrs. Horton instead of just making one for her. I felt that it was to give her a chance to talk about what issues she saw in class and what outcomes she wanted to see from an improvement plan. As a former teacher of the year, it is obvious that Mrs. Horton knows how to teach and is usually very invested in teaching. Teachers that don't want to teach don't usually come to school during vacations, holidays to work in their classroom to get it ready for students. I felt that this showed Mrs. Horton was not always overly critical and mean to students. I would work on getting Mrs. Horton back to that mindset with feedback and careful observations, as well as strategies to deal with a particularly bad class if that's what it is. Mrs. Wilson, in her regular observations, might not have provided feedback to Mrs. Horton, and feedback is an important component of observations walkthroughs. Mrs. Horton should know what was observed every time. This will help her grow in her teaching. Continued. In my district, a mentor is assigned to first and second year teachers to help them with the transition to a new school. I especially appreciated my first year since I was new to teaching, but she was in a different academy, so she was all the way across the building. So it's sometimes hard to discuss issues that came up in class. So I feel that Mrs. Horton needs another senior classroom teacher that is near her, even in the same hallway. To help her through this rough time so she could just stop and say, hey, I need a break, or this is what's happening, can I get your feedback on this, be a sounding board. And also to help her come up with strategies to reduce the stress caused by rowdy and unruly students that are causing an issue in class if that's the case. Assigning a mentor teacher will help Mrs. Horton because she will have a colleague to discuss issues with, and it will help her not feel so alone. as she struggles with this life-changing event. Also, having just one senior colleague that has been there with it will help her feel less like her business is being aired out. Mrs. Horton might just need a trusted colleague to help keep her on the right path, and having a mentor will also help her see what other teachers are doing in the classroom. Continued. Even though it may seem like a pain to Mrs. Horton, I think it's very important that she documents the type of interaction she has with her students. This will help her see how often she yells or corrects a student. She shouldn't be yelling at them, but sometimes it happens, especially when teachers are dealing with students who push their buttons. Documenting this can open Mrs. Horton's eyes to just how much she is really criticizing her students, and she can start to focus on correcting students in a positive way instead of just telling them they are wrong or yelling at them. I would also recommend having Mrs. Horton videotape herself and then tally up the interactions, because she might get distracted and be like, oh, I forgot to do that. So that she can see how she comes across while teaching. Since Mrs. Horton says that the accusations are lies, in order to stop the behaviors she's exhibiting, she needs to see them for herself. Only then will Mrs. Horton really learn and change the way she is teaching. Otherwise, she might push back to the measures suggested, and the district will lose a good teacher for good. So that is my case study. Thank you.